All right, here it is, the long-awaited analysis of a whole stream of interesting news stories. The presidential debate, presidential immunity. What the heck is the Chevron decision, and why could it might possibly explain something like a second American Revolution? That's right, we're going to talk about all of that and more on this Independence Day episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Jeremy's Razors. And we want you to all go into our circle chat and join our community, because a lot of the episodes that we get, a lot of the information that we go over comes directly from requests from our community. And it's no different than today. We've had a lot of people that asked us to go over the presidential debates, go after some of the Supreme Court decisions that have come out and explain some of the significance of it from a historical standpoint. And interestingly enough, a lot of these decisions are very, let's just say, indirectly connected to the reasons for the first American Revolution. And you probably wouldn't know that if you believe that it's all about taxation without representation, but it's actually a little bit more complex. And we're going to actually talk about some of the similarities between, let's just say, jolly old England during the American Revolution and the current federal bureaucracy today. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me, my beautiful bride, we're looking very patriotic, Queen of the Bees, Tina.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. Hamilton is not with us, but that's okay. He's still with us. He didn't die. He's just not here. He's just not here in the studio for this episode. He's probably out there celebrating Independence Day, as I'm sure you all are as well. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, first of all, we did an episode, a couple Independence Days ago, where we talked about the real reason for the American Declaration of Independence, the real reason for us separating from Great Britain, because as you know, so many people now, if you ask a person on the street, you'd be lucky to hear him even say taxation without representation. And while that was significant, a lot of times it's misunderstood, that very thing, taxation without representation, that's misunderstood. And then the other thing that's misunderstood is the fact that there was about 26 other articulated reasons for why the United States separated from the United Kingdom. And the reason why this is relevant, not only because it's Independence Day, but relevant to a lot of the decisions that have been made. And we're talking about Supreme Court decisions, again, like the Chevron decision. We're talking about the whole concept of presidential immunity. And even the debates. There's a common thread amongst all of these, and it's this whole idea of the federal bureaucracy. Because one of the things that the founders were fighting against was not just this idea that the kingdom could levy taxes against the colonies without representation. It was the executive branch within the UK government that was treating, Americans and who consider themselves free-born British citizens, treating them with this idea that they could essentially act with impunity, that the crown could come in and take away rights from them, and there was no way that they could really redress these grievances. And so it wasn't just taxation. It was the Quartering Act. It was the Stamp Act, which again was a form of the taxation. But it was a number of other decisions. It was the fact that the crown came in and was messing with the local judicial system, that they could impose arbitrary rules on them that, again, put the American colonists in a position where they felt like they were being treated like second-class citizens. Well, we've gone through about 248 years of taxation with representation, and we're actually paying a lot more taxes than we were then.
Turns out we don't like that either.
Yeah, it turns out we don't like that either. But it's not just that. There is another issue with representation taking place. Because again, the tax rates that were levied against the colonists were actually fairly small. They were mild. Right. You could actually make a good economic justification for why the colonies should have been paying taxes in order to pay for the wars that were fought to defend the borders of the colonies that had been used for the French and Indian War, a significant portion which had taken place, or the 7 Years' War as it was known in Europe. You can make a good argument, right? Make a good argument that, well, yeah, the colonists should bear some of the burden for the presence of British troops that were used to defend them. Well, that makes sense, right? But it was the whole idea of no, but representation, right? We've got to have a say in our own taxation. If we don't have a say in our own taxation, then it feels arbitrary. It can feel punitive at times. And sometimes it probably was punitive. Sometimes it was protectionist, right? The whole reason why they were throwing tea into the harbor was because England had set up a monopoly through the East India Trading Company. And so now it wasn't just a tax on tea. It was, this is the only tea you're allowed to buy, right? So there was all these reasons that came with a lack of representation. And now when you have a massive federal bureaucracy, there's also problems with a potential lack of representation. And what we're going to talk about today is why that first war for independence and the reasons behind it, some of those same reasons exist today. And the debate that's going on within the Supreme Court, within the presidential debate, is increasingly becoming about the federal bureaucracy. And speaking of declaring one's independence, you should declare independence from companies that hate you. And that's why you should buy Jeremy's Razors. That's right, jeremy'srazors.com. Use promo code Nick. You're going to get 15% off on all the stuff that you need, whether it's to groom a lovely, luxurious beard or to shave said beard. And I'm going to tell you, I've tried razors on this beard before, and they typically break because they're made with stupid things like steel, but not Jeremy's Razors. No, they're made exclusively from Roundhouse Kicks by Chuck Norris. It's the only thing that works on my beard when my wife decides I do need to shave it for some temporary time before it, of course, grows back. And then I use Jeremy's beard oil. But it doesn't stop there. You can also get various soaps, shampoos, deodorant, pretty much all the stuff that you need delivered directly to your door without ever having to go back and shop at some place that, quite frankly, hates you, the country, and everything that you stand for. So, as Jeremy likes to say, don't give your money to people that hate you. Give it to him. And when you do, using promo code Nick, we get a little bit too. So I definitely appreciate that. Once again, jeremy'srazors.com, promo code Nick, get 15% off. And once again, let's get back to the show. Let's go ahead and jump into this. So again, why did America separate from the UK in the first place? And despite what some people would have you believe, it wasn't because they had to pay nominal taxes on a couple of items or goods and services, right? It was that process by which taxes were levied. And it meant something to the American colonists that they be a part of their governing system. Because if you look at the UK, the Magna Carta, you look at the history of, King John and the fact that the nobles revolted against King John, and you have this first establishing this idea that a central executive branch, an executive authority, in this case being the king, shouldn't be able to just arbitrarily levy taxes. There should be a process by which the people, and in this case it was the nobles or the landowners, should be a part of that process. And over time, this developed, right? It started off as the people that owned land, and then we expanded suffrage or representation to people that could get drafted and go over and fight and be a part of the levy, right? And then eventually it expanded to include women who, to this day are still not a part of the draft, right? But it was this idea of having equal representation within the government. If you are subject to the laws of the government, that you should have some say with respect to how those laws are made, how those taxes are levied, et cetera, right? And so even though they were colonists, they still considered themselves British. And part of this was because for a long time, that is how it operated within the colonies. The UK, the king, the crown, was benefiting from the trade in the colonies, but wasn't levying taxes directly on them in many cases. And so this was seen as kind of a usurpation of the normal order of things within the American colonies. And the reason why I talk about all of this is because there are so many people now that will try to denigrate our founding fathers as nothing more than rich white slave owners that didn't want to pay their fair share, right? That sounds like a common narrative we hear today. Maybe not the slave owner part. Of course, they believe that if you own a business, your laborers, you're treating them like slaves anyways, right? But it's kind of it's part of this Marxist retelling.
Wage slaves.
Yeah, it's part of this Marxist retelling of the American Revolution of, independence, the fight, and the reasons for it. And the reason why it's important for people to properly understand what was at stake here, or what was the fundamental reasoning here. And I'm gonna read off this article by Jared Walczak, who's someone that Christian and I know from Virginia politics before he started working over at the Tax Foundation. And I want to read some excerpts from a article that he wrote. And I agree with most of this. There's some that I think, maybe overemphasizing certain things a little bit more and maybe not giving enough attention to other things, but I do think he does a pretty good job. And so from Jared over at Tax Foundation, in his day, James Otis was a prominent lawyer, legislator, and patriot, but today his name is all but forgotten. But when all else fades from memory, words endure. His rallying cry of taxation without representation is tyranny became the watchwords of the American Revolution and remain familiar to our ears. American independence, which we celebrate this week, was born of a tax revolt. That revolt had little to do with tax rates. Oppressive levels of taxation have fomented other rebellions, but not this one. The truth is, colonists paid very little in taxes, directly or more frequently indirectly. Tax burdens in the colonies were incredibly light, far lighter than in England, and woefully insufficient to cover the cost of colonial administration. Nor did the luminaries of the American Revolution operate under the misapprehension that taxes would go down if they won their independence. Set aside for a moment the financing of a long and destructive war, a new nation would receive no subsidies from the mother country. It would likely face an even more punitive tariff regime than the restrictions under which the colonies already operated. It would have to fund its own administration and would have to take up the cost of national defense, even under the shaky framework of the Articles of Confederation. It was clear from the start that victory in this tax revolt meant paying more in taxes, not less. So why did they do it? Because for champions of American independence, the problem was not that taxes were high, but they were arbitrarily, occasionally capricious and punitive, and most importantly, adopted without the consent of the governed. Now, again, I think everything you just said there was fairly accurate, right? I don't find anything wrong with that. The only part that I would say, and again, he's writing this for the Tax Foundation, and so there's an emphasis on taxes and the tax revolt and the nature of it. The representation point, though, was not just important from the perspective of taxes. It was important through everything else as well. Regulations. Like I said, some of the things that the colonists were the most angry about were not necessarily tax related, they were trade related. Right? It was being told that you're not allowed to buy certain products from certain places. You're not allowed to buy competitive products. One of the reasons why coffee started to become more popular in the United States is, in somewhat due to the fact that if you got to pay more for tea, you look for alternatives. This is something that we talk about a lot. Like a lot of times government will impose rules or regulations thinking that they're going to achieve their desired end state without really taking into consideration that people just don't behave the way you want them to. They behave in their own best interest. And sometimes their own best interest involves alternatives or seeking alternatives from whatever has been taxed or regulated. But the reason why this is so important to understand about the American Revolution, this idea of self-determination, of individual liberty, of property rights, of representative government, was because, again, without it, laws start to become arbitrary and punitive. Now, what does this have to do with the American government today?
The deep state.
You're not wrong, right? You're not wrong.
Unelected officials, unelected bureaucrats creating laws within laws and fees.
Yeah.
And charging people arbitrary fees based on their interpretation of laws that Congress has passed. So Congress passes a law, it goes over to the agencies. The agency then attaches a whole bunch of rules and regulations to that law, which aren't a part of the original law. So they weren't voted on by Congress. It's just their interpretation of how to enforce this law. And the Chevron decision is a big deal because of that. And if you look at the leftist cope right now, it's insane. I mean, they're losing their minds. I can't open X without seeing all these people talking about how you're on your own. And now justices are going to decide what's good and what's not good instead of the experts. And we all know you're supposed to trust the experts.
So let's talk about this real quick. This first thing I want people to understand, and I'm going to ask a question. I want you guys to guess. Don't Google. All right, ready? Okay. So I typed in, what is the total number of federal regulations? Total number of federal regulations. Okay. Now I got this back from plainlanguage.gov. Now I'm already skeptical because it's a .gov, but
the number of federal
regulations. Okay, so
across the board.
Regulations, here's what it says under plainlanguage.gov, government site. Regulations tell Americans how to get benefits, how to meet safety standards, and how to pay their taxes. There are now over how many?
I'm going to say millions.
Federal regulations. You're going to just say millions. Millions could be anywhere from 2 million to 999.
Okay, fine.
Give me a number.
I'm going to say 1.5 million.
1.5 million.
I think I'm wrong with this, but I'm pretty sure isn't the number of pages something like 300,000 or 400,000?
So Christian's a
And
little
then
bit,
there's laws within those
so
laws.
Christian's a little bit closer, right? Because they don't even tell you in this little summary. They say there are now over 200,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations.
200,000 pages.
Pages.
Well,
So here's what you need to understand. Okay. So I'm trying to
you
find.
framed up your question
I
as
know.
if there was an answer.
There is an answer, but the problem is that I'm looking through here right now. Notice I didn't ask for the number of pages. How many regulations? And then I go to another one. Here's nationalarchives.gov, right? The Code of Federal Regulations is the codification of the general and permanent rules published in the Federal Registrar by the executive departments and agencies of the federal government. It is divided into 50 titles that represent broad areas subject to federal regulation. Okay, again, I don't have a summary yet. How many federal laws are there in total? Although there is no precise calculation of how many federal statutes exist, this is from University of Connecticut. Chase says, and this is from 2019.
Okay.
2019. Chase says the most cited number is approximately 300,000 laws, many that cover government agency regulations.
And this was before COVID.
How many federal regulations are created each year? For example, the number of final rules published each year is generally in the range of 2,500 to 4,500, according to the Office of the Federal Registrar. While some of those rules may have substantial economic, legal, or policy effects, many of them are routine in the nature and impose minimal regulatory burden, if any. That's from 2011. From 2011, they were saying 2,500 to 4,500 per year. Per year.
I remember there was this chart that somebody shared that showed the number of pages of regulations compared to when the advent of word processing came along.
Yeah.
And it was basically, the analogy that they were, or the conclusion that they were drawing was word processing and its consequences have been devastating for the United States of America because it allowed for the exponential growth in federal regulations.
Yeah.
Nick.
Well, wait, I got one more thing. I got one more little fun fact I want to share on this, and then we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper.
So we have to say that neither of us could be right because we can't.
We don't know. Like they're not even telling us.
Okay.
The best number we had was over 300,000, and that was back in 2019. Again, this is the Google search I did was what is the total number of federal regulations? All right, here we go. Now, what's the difference between a federal law and a federal regulation? This is important. This is important to our discussion. Laws are passed by both branches of Congress and signed by the president. Laws establish requirements or prohibitions. Regulations are published by the executive branch agencies to clarify their interpretation of a law and how a law will be implemented. So let's clarify something here real quick. There are times where it makes sense to have federal regulations, right? So a regulation can also govern how the federal government is supposed to act, right? So we have like a uniform code of military justice within the military. You can tell a regulation that you want them to have certain, processes for how they implement federal law. Where you get into trouble is this. It's when legislators write very, very open-ended laws, right? So the Clean Air Act or whatever it is. And within there, they might put certain things that they want. They might put certain objectives. They might put certain fines or penalties. But in many cases, they write these fairly open. They give it to the executive branch agencies. So they're like, oh, yeah, the EPA is going to be responsible for carrying out these laws. Hey, EPA, go out and promulgate regulations. Develop fines and fees. So you got a very, very broad law that somebody voted on, right? And then the regulatory agency creates all the subsequent regulations to carry out the law. And so the executive branch gets to say, we're not creating law. That's the legislature's job. We're just doing regulations in order to clarify how we interpret this law and how we plan to go out and faithfully execute it. So what happens when you have a legislative branch, right? The representative government we're all looking for, right? That our founders fought for. What happens when you have a representative government that sees that it's in their best interest to write broadly worded, nice sounding pieces of legislation and then hand it over to the experts to figure out how to do it all?
This is how you get the current managerial class that actually rules us. There's plenty of people that have talked about this. Rudyard, actually, who you have an interview with him that recently went out, referenced this in a video of his where he talked about a book by, I think it was Samuel T. Francis, The Leviathan and Its Enemies, and he talked about the rise of the managerial class. There's other people too. We've discussed this on this podcast over the past year or so. Like a lot of the neo-reactionary people have talked about this. A lot of paleo-conservatives have talked about this as well. The managerial class basically is running this country at this point. Yeah. And for anybody who questions that, go back and look at the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and tell me with a straight face that Joe Biden is actually running the executive branch. He's not running anything.
Yeah. Does anybody really believe that Joe's in charge right now? I mean, come on.
He is not in charge. And people are like, oh, well, his handlers are in charge. No, they're certainly partially in charge. Who's really in charge is the federal bureaucracy is in charge. The executive branch has become something entirely different than what the founders originally intended. When the founders got together in Philadelphia in 1787 and they created the office of the presidency and they created the executive branch, what they wanted to do is that they wanted to separate executive power from legislative power on purpose because they knew the flaws of a pure democracy like ancient Athens, or in a parliamentary system where the legislative and executive branches are kind of merged together. The whole point of the presidency is to execute the law faithfully, but it's not to make law. And that's what the executive branch has become. But it's even more perverse than that because it's not the president that's making law. It's the unnamed, unelected, nameless, faceless blob of the federal bureaucracy that's making the law.
Yep.
And you know what's even more nefarious is the fact that the president, who's supposed to be the head of the executive branch, is effectively powerless to do anything to halt the actions of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy exists, despite the fact that they're supposedly under the executive branch, the bureaucracy exists independently of the presidency. The president can't come in and just the president of the United States cannot come in and do to the bureaucracy what I think needs to be done, which is what Milei is currently doing in Argentina.
Yeah.
You know, it was a couple weeks ago that Milei announced that he was dissolving the entire Ministry of Women, Genders, and Diversity.
Yeah, gone.
Which is basically their DEI department, and he fired 85% of the workforce. No president would be able currently to do anything remotely like that.
Well, and let's talk about that real quick because this is an important distinction. Now, obviously, if anybody that's listened to us for a while is like, well, guys, don't you like the fact that the executive branch has limitations on its power? Yes, we do. But what's problematic about what we currently have is the legislature has now passed laws in such a way, especially with civil service laws, to where the very people that the executive branch is supposed to be responsible for, because remember, the president is our representative. The president is supposed to be able to faithfully execute the laws through the executive branch. How is the president supposed to do that if he can't fire people that he feels are standing in the way of achieving that? And so there's this problem that we have right now where there's elements, like a lot of people talk about how, the legislature has just kind of surrendered its authority to the executive branch. Yes and no. And this is I used to say that. I said the real problem here is the legislature has surrendered its authority and its duties and responsibilities to the executive branch, and now the executive branch is too powerful. What it is that's not exactly accurate. It's worse.
They've taken over the executive branch with their bureaucrats, right?
No, it's worse. This is what I have to say. Like, it is worse. The legislature has given up powers in ways that it never should have, and so has the executive in ways that it never should have.
Which is the other branch of government, the bureaucratic state.
So now we have effectively
an unconstitutional branch of the government,
a fourth branch, which is not beholden to the people.
It's not elected.
How do you hold it accountable? How do you hold it accountable? Now, the argument would be like, well, Congress can hold it accountable. Sure. How are they doing with that? Right? How are they doing with that? Have they been willing to cut budgets? Have they been willing to pull back? The bottom line is the executive branch, the bureaucracy portion of the executive branch, has managed to protect itself in such a way to where it is ever expanding with respect to power, ever expanding with respect to personnel, ever expanding with respect to budgets, and protected from accountability. So it has set itself up to where it has its own interests. We've talked about this before, where Thomas Sowell, who used to be a Marxist, right, studying under Milton Friedman, still a Marxist, one season doing an internship with the federal government taught him that oh, wait a second. These bureaucratic agencies, these bureaucratic divisions, they have their own interests and they will pursue those interests. And they have ways to do it, which keeps them completely insulated from any sort of accountability. Now, you're probably asking, Nick, how is that possible? If they work for the president, then the president can order them to do things and they'll go do it, right? As long as it's within law, because obviously the president can't order the executive branch to do something that has not been authorized under law by the legislative branch. That's the check and balance, right? So, but if it comes to firing someone, well, he should be able to fire someone. Nope, because the legislature passed civil service laws. Now, keep in mind, once upon a time, the federal government was so small that one of the things that presidential candidates would do in order to gain popularity, in order to gain support, in order to gain maybe funding, whatever it was, is they'd promise federal jobs. Now, when the only federal jobs available to you are like the post office, right, and maybe commissions within the military or things of that nature, there's not a lot for you to hand out. But what we had was called the spoils system. And the flaw in the spoils system was anybody running for president could essentially promise any sort of federally appointed positions to their supporters in order to gain votes, in order to gain funds, and whatever it was, right? But again, the limiting concept here was there just wasn't a lot of federal positions to hand out. Nothing compared to what we have today, where you're talking about tens of thousands of positions, right? Arguably millions, but
no, it is the federal bureaucracy at this point is actually larger than the population of the United States was at the founding of this country.
So now you're
especially
probably,
if you count contractors.
Now you're probably asking, okay, but how is that possible?
How is it constitutional that the executive branch can't fire their own employees?
We're gonna. I want to read something off, and this is it's Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. What this does is this lays out what Congress is responsible for, and keep in mind, since Congress is the one that writes the laws, right? Congress is the one that is supposed to under these restrictions, because Article 1, Section 8 is the list of authorities. Remember, the founders all argued to the states it's okay to accept the federal Constitution because the federal government's powers are limited and enumerated. Since the judiciary has limited powers with respect to overview, since the executive branch is only able to faithfully execute the laws that Congress passes, and since these are the enumerated powers of Congress, what we're about to read off is initially the only thing the federal government was allowed to do. Now, keep in mind, Congress doesn't get to change what it's supposed to do without a constitutional amendment, right? So here's what Congress's powers were in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. But keep in mind, there is no federal income tax. So when they're doing things largely through tariffs, it doesn't matter where the product enters the United States, it has to be collected uniformly across all of them. So it can't like pick on one state over another state or one individual over another individual. So it can do that. Now, some people will say, oh, the general welfare clause, that means Congress can do whatever it wants, right? If Congress could do whatever it wanted in the name of the general welfare, why would there be enumerated powers? The general welfare was meant to actually be a restriction on federal power, not a blank check. If it was meant to be a blank check, it would have just said the general welfare of the United States, period. You wouldn't have to list anything else because as long as Congress could determine it was in the general welfare, they had the authority to do so. The fact that anything follows that portion of Article 1, Section 8 is confirmation that general welfare is not whatever Congress determines to be the general welfare. Congress is allowed to act on the things that it was specifically given within the Constitution, and in so doing, must keep the general welfare in its mind before it allocates resources, promulgates regulations, or spends money. So it's a restriction, not a blank check. So let's list out what are the enumerated powers that Congress was given. To borrow money on the credit of the United States.
Well, they've certainly done that.
Yes. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. To coin money regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard weights and measures. So they wanted consistency across the United States. A pound is a pound is a pound. They didn't want 50 different, or at that time, 13 different rules of it. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. So again, it's very specific. To establish post offices and post roads. So they have the authority to have the post office, and they have the authority to build transportation mechanisms to facilitate the post office. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to the respective writings and discoveries. The patent office, right? To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is a co-equal branch of government, right? But there's also federal courts to deal with federal law. That's what the tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court are. So Congress can't establish another court equal to the Supreme Court, but it can establish lower courts in order to deal with federal crimes and federal issues. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. So again, we're talking about international, foreign affairs. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Once again, warfare, foreign policy. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to the use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. So you can raise money for an army, but every 2 years, you got to redo your budget. Right? Once again, foreign policy. To provide and maintain a navy, foreign policy. To make rules for the government and regulations for the land and naval forces, foreign policy in the military. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repeal invasions, foreign policy and domestic unrest. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for the governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So this basically gives power for the federalization of the militia in times of need for the entire country, but to reserve to the states their policies and their practices with respect to selecting officers, etc. To exercise executive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may be by session of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution of the government of the United States or in any other department or office thereof. So it's talking about basically their jurisdiction over Washington, D.C., okay, and then to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers.
That last part's always left out.
The foregoing powers. So understand, this is where issues with the supremacy clause get into, effect. So I know we're talking a lot about the Constitution right now, not the Declaration of Independence, but the reason for that is we want to talk about, again, why this federal bureaucracy is a direct threat and very, very similar to why we had a revolution in the first place.
Notice how there was nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that talks about education policy or energy policy or housing or welfare or redistribution of any sort of wealth, any sort of entitlement program, anything related to retirement. This also includes things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare.
None of this was the jurisdiction of the federal government. So here's the question. Why do we have a massive federal bureaucracy? Why do we have a massive federal bureaucracy which always requires massive deficit spending? Why? And people will come to the conclusion, well, this is unconstitutional, Nick. This is the problem. Unfortunately, it is constitutional. Why? Because of the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave the federal government the first time in its history the legal right to continually exact a federal income tax based off of individuals rather than through the states. So now, no matter where you live in the United States, they get to collect federal income tax. And in addition to that, and this is the part where I think there are constitutional issues, there's now a whole series of other federal taxes associated with your income, but don't fall into the typical category that we think of them. Things like capital gains taxes, things like inheritance taxes. Well, now they've broadly defined all this as, well, this is any sort of income coming into you. So now the federal government can set up a whole host of taxes associated with taking this money. And because there's no restriction on how much they can take from an individual, there's no restriction on how they can structure it. They can do progressive income taxes, which means they can tax people differently. Well, now what do you run into? We have a massive federal bureaucracy that is continuing to grow now, because now the federal government, they can impose educational rules on you, but they can take your money and tell you only get it back as long as if you accept federal dollars, you accept federal regulations. Oh, no, we can't tell you that your drinking age has to be 21. We just won't give you any of the funds for your highway system.
There was a lawsuit on that.
There was.
It was I think it was South Dakota versus Dole.
Yeah.
And South Dakota sued the federal government and said, you can't withhold our highway funds in exchange for us raising the drinking age, and went all the way to the Supreme Court. This was like in the 80s, I believe. And the Supreme Court sided with the federal government on that. But
which is interesting too, because again, this whole idea of judicial review, of the Supreme Court having the last say on anything with respect to laws, it was not part of the original constitutional deal. The states never would have ratified the Constitution if everyone had been very upfront with, oh yeah, and if there's any disagreement between the states and the federal government gets to decide who's right. Because that's essentially what it means. If you allow the Supreme Court to be the final arbiter of what's correct, well then now the federal government gets to decide when the federal government has gone outside of its bounds. Would you sign any contract? Would you set a contract with a bank that says, I'm going to agree to pay this mortgage for my house? And if there's any sort of disagreement between me and the bank gets to decide who's right. Would you sign that contract? No, you would want a third-party arbitration. The question is what does that look like? Well, the reason it wasn't a huge problem for the first 130 years of our country's founding is because before the progressive era and before the massive expansion of the federal government, before the federal income tax, the federal government didn't have a lot of money to do stuff. It didn't have a lot of authority to do stuff. It didn't have a lot of jurisdiction to do stuff. That was reserved to the states, just like the 10th Amendment reinforces.
But we've slowly been chipping away at that over time. It started arguably with the Civil War.
Yes.
And that took off the table, obviously secession, but it also took off the table nullification.
Yes.
Which was supposed to be a check against federal power. And then you had, during the Gilded Era, right, post-Civil War, 1870s, 80s, 90s, you had an expansion of cronyism within the federal government. This was particularly the case with things like railroads.
Yeah, railroads are horrible.
Right? And so Congress started being more directly involved in the economy on a scale that they previously hadn't been. But then it really picks up after the progressive era begins, particularly with Teddy Roosevelt and especially with Woodrow Wilson.
If you want to know the part where the country started to go off the rails, or if you want to know the part where the seeds were sown for the country to go into the direction that we currently have, it was the progressive era, and specifically under Woodrow Wilson, because you had not only the passage of the 16th Amendment, which was the direct levying of an income tax by the federal government, you had the 17th Amendment, which drastically undermined the power of state legislatures in relation to the federal government, and you had the creation of the Federal Reserve, which essentially sowed the seeds for the federal government to engage in central banking practices, which allowed it to finance things outside of taxing and borrowing.
It was also during the Wilson era that you started seeing the concept of democracy, more democracy, replacing the old Republican virtues of what the United States was believed to function as within the general public. Once you get past the 1920s, democracy starts to replace republic as the generic term to describe the political system that we have. And conservatives bring up all the time, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Unfortunately, we are a democracy at this point. And the reason that we are a democracy at this point is because we've steadily chipped away at the various safeguards against the mob rule type of democracy that the founding fathers actually tried to repeatedly warn us about. If you read Madison's notes on the Constitution, there's not a single positive word said about democracy in the Constitutional Convention. Repeatedly, delegates to the Constitutional Convention bring up about how democracy is synonymous with Athens.
Yeah.
And Athens destroyed itself through democracy. They wanted to avoid that, and they wanted to build a system that was more reminiscent of the Roman Republic, but they also learned the lessons of what collapsed the Roman Republic, and so therefore they made changes to that system. They didn't make it exactly the same, right? But they made changes to that system to try to avoid things like independent armies staging coups and civil wars and stuff like that. This is also why you get Jefferson saying things like standing armies are a big danger. But what we have now, the current system that we have now, and this gets back into who's really running the country. What we now have is a system that doesn't even, it pretends to be a democracy, but in reality, it's actually more of an oligarchy. It's an unelected, shadowy oligarchy. When people like Trump say that it's a deep state, he might not have read all the theory on this, but he's absolutely right that it is a deep state. It is almost a shadow government. It's a government within a government. It's this unelected fourth branch that's actually running things. And this whole pushback that you're starting to see take place, a second revolution, so to speak, in some ways, I wouldn't even call it a revolution. I would call it a restoration.
Yes.
The recent court ruling that we saw with the Supreme Court with Chevron, that's not actually revolutionary. Left-wing actors will call it revolutionary. If you go on Twitter and you read some of the stuff, there's this one tweet that this guy put out that got a bunch of retweets, but also a bunch of ratios. And he was like, the gall of the Supreme Court to think that they know best than the actual experts on how to run our day-to-day lives.
That okay? So real quick, before we go any further, explain Chevron.
So Chevron is, I've got my notes up here actually, because I want to make sure that I explain this correctly to people. Chevron is a 1984 Supreme Court case. It was actually Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council, Inc. And what came out of that court case is a concept called the Chevron Doctrine. And in the Chevron Doctrine, the Supreme Court held that federal courts are compelled, not suggested, not recommended, they're compelled to defer to a federal agency's interpretation of whatever an ambiguous law is when it comes to the execution of that law. And so what it means is that they have to rely on the agency's definition on what the law says when it comes to executing that law in order to determine whether or not the law itself is constitutional, or a particular regulation is constitutional, or a particular action is constitutional.
The reason why that is, first of all, insane and such a major departure, because this is 1984, people. We're not talking about a Chevron doctrine from, 1792, where it was like, oh yeah, this is definitely in conjunction with what we want. Or not 1792, it would have been in the 17. Oh yeah, that would have been fine. Anyway, the point is this. They're basically giving deference to the federal bureaucracy. So Congress passes one of these broad laws. They tell an executive branch AG to go out there and promulgate regulations. You look at one of these regulations and you're like, this is not a faithful execution of the law. This is inappropriate. This is unconstitutional. This is, maybe illegal, whatever it is. I'm going to go challenge this in court. The court just told all the federal courts, you have to assume the federal government's interpretation. So now the burden is on you to demonstrate that, well, no, this isn't a faithful way to execute this law. Do you know what a huge advantage that gives to the federal bureaucracy in court?
Right, because if you were going to go to court with the federal government, it used to be that you had to show how, this regulation was enforced on me in this way, and they didn't do it in this way to these other people. That was the only way that you could say this. You
could make an equal protection before the law.
That is the only mechanism at that point.
You could either make
you couldn't actually say the regulation itself was unconstitutional. You just had to. Your argument had to be the application of it wasn't.
The other recourse that you had was the law itself being unconstitutional. Yeah.
Right,
so
right.
you
could either challenge the entire law, which again, when some of these laws were written so broadly, that could sometimes be easier to challenge. That can sometimes be more difficult to challenge, because especially if you have a Supreme Court that believed in giving deference to the legislature. So keep something in mind here, right? Progressive era, the emphasis goes from certain founding principles to democracy. Democracy has one moral imperative: majority rules. The majority's right. If you have a Supreme Court which looks at its role as giving deference to the legislator because that's the will of the people, well, then it makes perfect sense to say, well, yes, if the people elected Congress and Congress passed this law and told the federal bureaucracy to do these things, well, then, of course, we're going to assume that's all correct and exactly what they wanted. And now you have the burden of demonstrating that that's not the way it is. But again, that produces a massive financial burden, not to mention I would say, a very unfair standard, especially when Congress starts writing broader and broader laws, which allows a huge runway for the creation of excessive regulations.
Right. So taking down the government is like a David and Goliath kind of, there was just no way to take down this monstrosity.
Well, it's the other
and
thing.
So, but the case that actually took Chevron down is a real David and Goliath story. You've got these fishermen who were being charged something like $700 a day in order to be allowed to fish in this area because of some kind of a regulation. And it was driving them out of business. It was putting them under. And finally, we get a court that's willing to go back to what it always should have been.
Well, let me give you another example of how the bureaucracy would punish people, or how they would get the bureaucracy to do what they wanted you to do. They would tell somebody, so I dealt with a situation like this in my district. Somebody was trying to build something. All right, so they're trying to build like a small little, business. Nothing big, nothing massive, not a massive plant, just small little business. Took up, a couple acres. State regulations came in and said, well, we have the Department of Environmental Quality, you got to do X, Y, and Z. But then there was also Army Corps of Engineers that was also tasked with ensuring that certain EPA regulations and other things and other standards were being met for federal regulations. So the interesting part is they would come in and they wouldn't tell you couldn't do what you were doing. They would say you could possibly be in violation of X, Y, and Z. And if you are in violation of X, Y, and Z, that constitutes a $25,000 fine per day. Well, what do you think happens? Oh, well, shoot, I don't want to be in violation. How do I navigate the regulation in order to continue working? And then all of a sudden the state would say you got to go to the feds. The feds would say you got to go to the state, or they would say you have to go to this department, or you have to go to this department, or you got to submit these forms. And then you'd submit all your forms. And they'd come back and they say, oh, this part of the form is wrong. Oh, okay, sorry, no problem. You send it back. Oh, okay, well, this part's also wrong. They wouldn't go through and tell you where all the problems were. They'd go find one problem and send it back. And this could last for months. Meanwhile, you've got heavy equipment. You've got everything else that you need in order to set this up. And again, I'm not talking about a massive corporation here. Right? What do you think that does to the cost of doing business? What do you think that does to real estate prices? What do you think that does to the price of everything that you pay for associated with something when all of this additional money is now packed into the cost of doing business because of a massive federal bureaucracy that didn't even necessarily tell you were breaking the law, but threatened you with crippling fines that you'd never be able to pay off and could potentially put your entire business underwater in order to continue that project? This is the sort of reality people are dealing with right now. And the fact that a Supreme Court had told the federal bureaucracy, like, hey, yeah, all the odds are now stacked in their favor. And you've really got to find something unique that you can go after. And you're probably not going to be able to do it unless you have massive amount of funding. Because the moment you win in a lower court, well, they're just going to take it to the next court. It's the federal government. They're using your money to counteract your lawsuit. They can do this all day. They can, we'll go to the appeals. They'll file whatever they need to drag it out as long as possible. And they will bankrupt you. They will write you out in court. You're done. Because the legal precedent under Chevron gave them every single advantage. They already have advantages, again, by virtue of the fact they can sue you with your money. They're operating off of tax dollars. And
it's not just about businesses. It's actually ultimately about power. It's about where power resides in this country. This gets back to my point earlier about how, people who watch the debate are obviously asking themselves, who's really running the country? Because it's pretty clear that Joe Biden is not. The founding fathers envisioned a system where the executive actually executes.
Yes.
And we currently don't have that. And so by overturning Chevron, what we've done, and this gets back to my point about how what we're seeing is not necessarily a revolution so much as we're seeing a restoration. We're seeing a restoration where we're strengthening the executive, the actual executive, the presidency. We're strengthening the power of the presidency. This in conjunction with the recent court ruling about immunity, which is another thing that the left just absolutely melted down over. After that immunity case came down, I mean, you had members of the court. You had Sotomayor writing things like the president can now imprison and assassinate his political enemies without you know,
By
with
the way,
impunity.
if you wanted a perfect example, while someone like Sotomayor or someone of that legal philosophy should not be on the court, you couldn't read a dumber opinion.
And
there was nothing in that immunity that gave the president of the United States the ability to murder U.S. citizens with impunity.
In fact, Barrett mentioned that in her concurrence on that ruling, and she actually pointed specifically to the electors process, and she was like, "There's nothing in here that says that is an official act." What the court did in that case was they said there's official acts that you're carrying out as president, and then there's unofficial acts, and you have absolute immunity as president in furtherance of carrying out official acts. You don't when you're not carrying out an official act. Assassinating your political opponent is not an official act. There's no court in the world that would, at least in the United States, maybe in North Korea, right? There's no court in the United States that would say that's an official act. The Supreme Court itself did not provide a comprehensive definition of what constitutes an official and unofficial act because they didn't think that it was necessary to do that. All that they're trying to do is clarify that, yes, there are certain actions, and you can look in the Constitution in order to identify certain actions that fall under the purview of the president. And the president should not be able to be sued or prosecuted in executing his job. But that doesn't mean that he has a blanket, exercise to do whatever he wants. And instead, what you saw from the left after that court case was Joe Biden needs to start drone striking Republicans. And you know what it really is that they're projecting is what they're really doing.
Yeah.
The number of tweets and statements and news articles that were put out and op-ed pieces in the New York Times. I mean, there were literally things like, in order to serve his country, Joe Biden should imprison Donald Trump. And they're saying the quiet part out loud is what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why they flipped out about Chevron is because the federal bureaucracy overwhelmingly supports the left. There's a reason why once upon a time, even FDR, like a darling of progressive ideology, even FDR said you can't have public sector employee unions because the dynamic doesn't make sense, right? In a private sector union, you have two competing interests negotiating with one another. Both of them have power, right? The business owner has power over the means of production that they paid for, right? Their capital, their property. They have power over their property. The laborers have power over their labor. They can get together and negotiate in order to come to an agreed upon compromise. When you have public sector employee unions, right, and they are donating to political candidates, they're not negotiating with taxpayers. They're negotiating with the politicians they helped get elected. And the politicians aren't negotiating with their own money. They're negotiating with ours. And so even FDR recognized that public sector employee unions are an issue. Well, when that all changed in the 60s, now all of a sudden you have an environment where massive federal bureaucracies, right, are there to raise money for Democrat politicians.
They're also there to perpetuate. It becomes a self-licking ice cream cone if you think about it, because by giving the bureaucracy the power to effectively write their own laws, as long as they can point to anything ambiguous within federal law passed by Congress as a justification for their regulations, and then through the Chevron defense, force federal courts to recognize that as legitimate, right? If they have that power, what that means is that there is no limitation on the power of the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy can promulgate any regulation that increases its own power as long as they can point to any obscure law or abstract law or any ambiguous law in order to back that up. As long as that's there, there's no restriction. So what happens is that you see an exponential growth. This gets back to your point about the number of pages in the Federal Register of regulations. What you have is an exponential growth in the number of regulations at the same time that you have an exponential growth in the power of the regulators. This is how we've gotten to a point where the people that rule over us are not our representatives in Congress. They're not the president of the United States. They're the managerial class. They're the ones that actually rule the country.
Well, and what people also look at there. So again, the incentive structure has been completely perverted. And again, so you would ask, what are the two mechanisms for holding the bureaucracy accountable? Theoretically, primarily the executive branch, because they're supposed to run the bureaucratic branch, and then the legislature because they have control over funds. Well, what happens when the bureaucracy is the one getting the legislators elected? What happens when the legislators are now beholden to large-scale public sector employee unions and the general that operates largely in accordance with, leftist legislators? So, okay, that leaves the executive branch. Well, where's the executive branch here? Well, because of civil service laws, Because again, people looked at the spoils system and saw obvious problems with it, right? Should a presidential candidate be able to promise all of these jobs to their buddies and their cronies in order to get elected? Well, no, that doesn't seem right. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to set up civil service laws. What we're essentially going to say is that there are certain positions that the president gets to appoint, right? And there's thousands of positions, but they're largely things like everything from ambassadorships to things like political positions with cabinet heads and people that are focused on policy. But when it comes to the actual execution of regulations, they're all protected by civil service laws. It's not like Trump can go in to the EPA and say, hey, you guys have done a horrible job. I'm firing you. He can't do that. He might be able to fire director heads, but he can't fire, mid-level management. And they know it. So let me ask you something. If you're an ideologically driven member of middle management protected by civil service laws, and there's essentially no way you can get fired unless you are caught doing something blatantly illegal, how hard do you think it is to slow roll what the president wants to do?
Presidents come and go, but the bureaucracy is forever.
So that person's been there for 20 years. They're going to be there for 20 years. That president, maybe 4. Maybe 4. This particular Congress, whatever. You can wait them out.
That's one of the reasons why you've got some folks that want to push for basically term limits on bureaucracy, on bureaucrats.
The biggest,
like you can't work in a place, like in the federal government for longer than X amount of time.
Is that all that you'll do is create more of the managerial class because you'll have a revolving door. They'll go to a different agency, or they'll go to a contracting firm, or they'll enter electoral politics themselves, and you'll just create more of these people if you put in term limits. This is
instead we just need to eliminate.
Yeah, what we need to do is what Milei is currently doing in Argentina, where you are eliminating the bureaucracy, like you are closing the doors to agencies and firing your especially if you're a conservative. You have to understand these are your ideological enemies. You are funding your enemies who take their paycheck, donate a portion of it. This is also the danger with public sector unions, right? They will take a portion of their paycheck and then donate it to your political enemies who literally are campaigning on, I will expand the power of the bureaucracy. Notice how the president right now is utterly powerless at the moment, or at least arguably until Chevron was struck down, although even now it's still. The president is relatively powerless to do anything to mitigate the power of the bureaucracy. But if he wants to increase the power of the bureaucracy, he's got all the power in the world to do that. This is how you get a situation where it feels like that somebody like Donald Trump can go into office and he can't seem to change the system or drain the swamp. Joe Biden gets in there and he can fill the swamp up to, overflowing within a matter of weeks or months, if not days even. The reason why is because when they want to increase the power of government or increase the power of the bureaucracy, there's almost no obstacle in place. But when we want to shrink the power of the government or the power of the bureaucracy, it is effectively illegal and impossible to do so because we have a regulatory and legal framework that has made it so.
Well, this is one of the reasons, too, why the left flips out so much about the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court has been the one institution that it has been slightly more difficult to keep under control, because the Supreme Court can hold the federal bureaucracy accountable, provided that they violated the Constitution. Overturning Chevron was huge. I'm going to say it right now. On a moral level, overturning Roe v. Wade was the most significant, Supreme Court decision in my lifetime. But on a practical level for fighting back, Chevron, and it isn't close. It isn't close. Because the precedent that was set there was horrible. And so the reason why the left is flipping out over Chevron, like, oh, the experts, you know better than the experts. Exactly. When did that start, by the way? When did this whole idea of this technocratic government with experts running, when did that? Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton. He had a disdain for the Constitution. And he believed in this idea of a bureaucratic state that was managed by experts. And to some degree, it makes sense on a superficial level when you're like, oh, well, yeah, if we're going to have all these really complex, technically difficult things to manage, of course, we want experts to run those things. Except that the federal government was never meant to manage all of the things that it's now attempting to manage. And it seems like it doesn't matter. Thomas Sowell points this out too. He goes, it's amazing how many experts are behind some of the worst disasters in all of human history. right? It was the whiz kids that came up with the Vietnam War. Oh, a bunch of Harvard and Yale grads.
I have a question. I was curious to know, basically, if Trump went in and he just went, this whole section of this department is fired, they would then sue him, right? Sue the administration. They would go to it would probably go all the way to the Supreme Court. At that point, is it possible to render the administrative state unconstitutional?
No, he'd lose. And the reason why he would lose is because Congress passed, the Supreme Court would have to find that the legislative branch exceeded its authority in creating those civil service laws. The problem is you'd have a hard time justifying that because there's nothing constitutionally that prevents the Congress from putting certain regulations with respect to how funding is spent or how divisions of the government are created, right? And then there was a president that signed the civil service laws, right? It went through the constitutionally approved process to do this. It's going to have to go through the constitutionally approved process to unwind it. And that's what's so difficult because, as Jefferson pointed out, right, the tendency of governments is to expand at the expense of liberty. And because you can always find a justification, or you can always find so they call it rent seeking. It's this idea of creating constituencies which are now dependent upon your federal program or your federal spending or whatever else it is. These bureaucracies don't exist simply because Congress said so. They were set up in such a way to where now they have constituencies. I'll give you a perfect example of this. Social Security. Social Security is one of the most abysmally run retirement programs ever conceived by the mind of man. It would be if a private sector company said, oh, we too would like to provide something like Social Security for our clients. They would be immediately arrested by the federal government, which, by the way, for those of you keeping score at home, the federal government is the one running Social Security. But it operates like a Ponzi scheme, right? They take money from new investors who are forced to give money to the federal government, and then they give them to current pensioners. You can't do that legally in the private sector. The only reason the government can do it is because they have the ability to tax, whereas a private sector company has to get your money voluntarily. So understand, this is how, but if you say anything, go tell a 65-year-old Republican right now, go tell a 70-year-old Republican right now who can't stand the federal bureaucracy, who can't stand the deep state, who can't stand any of it. Hey, by the way, we're gonna have to mess with Social Security because, whoa, what, you're gonna do what? No, I paid into that. Mm-hmm. That's my money. I was forced to pay into it. And you know what? He's right.
Well,
he's right.
Even telling them the truth that you're doing right now will elicit a knee-jerk response.
Yes.
It's like this absolute, it makes them feel so bad that you're right, that it makes them feel horrible that they're now partaking of it. And that's kind of part of the issue is you've got people that are saddled with this, who now feel guilty for taking it, even though they paid into it and the whole deal. And so you've got this cycle where it's like, oh, well, now that I'm of the age, I have to partake.
Well,
I'm going to take
it. And FDR said this. Like when FDR was designing Social Security, there were people that came out and said, well, we should make this a pension program for people that can't afford it. And FDR was like, nope, everyone's going to pay into it and everyone's going to benefit from it because that's how you make sure it never goes away. And he was right. He was right because people rightfully feel entitled to something they paid for.
Yeah.
Especially when they've been told their whole life they're guaranteed to get it.
The problem is that politicians can lie about who's guaranteed money. That doesn't change how reality works, right? I mean, you can ignore reality all you want, but that doesn't mean that reality is going to change.
Well, let me give another example of this because that's a very broad example that affects pretty much everyone, right? I want to give another example of how the bureaucracy protects itself, right? When you have bureaucracy, when you have government programs that are set up and certain agencies are now responsible for distributing money, right? Distributing money in the form of subsidies to companies. There's a problem within economics called concentrated benefit and dispersed cost. So everyone in this country pays more for sugar than they should. They pay more for sugar than they should. But what it accounts to in your annual grocery budget is probably maybe a couple of bucks. What it means for the sugar industry is tens of millions of dollars. So are you going to get all hot and bothered about a couple of extra bucks in your annual grocery budget that you shouldn't be paying, and then go and lobby Congress to get rid of a sugar subsidy? No. Is the sugar industry, whose maybe very existence or profits absolutely depend upon that subsidy, are they going to lobby? Oh, you better believe it. There's a single member of Congress that is getting a bunch of rabid, pissed off calls about the sugar tariff. But I guarantee you that any representative that lives anywhere near, states or whatnot that are responsible for the sugar industry, they try to tinker with this. They're going to get $1 million of ads overnight running in their district nonstop talking about how they want to shut down American workers. They want to hurt American industry. So this is another way that the bureaucracy works in coordination with certain industries. That's also rent seeking, right? The third way that they do it is that because the agencies have a lot of power with respect to the creation of regulations, you think big companies are just going to sit by and hope for the best when it comes to writing regulations? No. Those big companies will first fight the bureaucracy until they realize they can't win. And then what they do is they go to their legislator and they donate enough money in the right places and they write the regulations, which are now going to become law, and feed themselves into the regulatory agency. So the consequences of having a massive federal bureaucracy with jurisdiction it was never meant to have, promulgating these regulations the way they are, is that everybody starts to recognize that you either get in on the game or you're going to be dominated by it, right? You either get on the train or you're going to get run over.
This is what Tocqueville warned about repeatedly when he came over here, actually, right? Almost everybody's heard about the famous quote that, democracies can last 250 years, but, they're not going to last once the people realize that they can vote themselves the public treasury. Bastiat also wrote some things warning about this process as well. He talked a lot about legal plunder.
Yes.
And when you pervert the law and you turn it into a mechanism of legal plunder, what will happen is that everybody who has a claim to the treasury, well, they'll be fighting inside the legislative palace, as he said, and the fighting outside will be no less, egregious. But the thing is that only those who have the power and influence to actually get a share of the spoils, so to speak, will actually benefit. And then he talks about how the suffering classes, they might have the best claim to being able to loot the treasury, but they're not always going to be the ones that benefit from it. Although it'll probably always be done in the name of those suffering classes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And this actually gets me to a point about what exactly is the current political process like in the United States. What we have right now is we have an entire political party whose entire unstated purpose is to loot the republic.
Mm-hmm.
We have a political party whose entire agenda is consolidating power and acquiring wealth and dispersing that power and wealth to its constituents. It's called the Democratic Party. That's their entire purpose. It's to loot the republic. But they know that there's no way that you can actually get away with looting the republic and campaign on that. And so what you have to do is you have to always come up with an excuse for it. You have to always come up with a victim for it. You have to always come up with a new current thing, right? This is why there's always a story. There's always a scandal. There's always
the latest
There's
thing.
always a need for a new deal. There's always a need for a bailout. There's always a need for an omnibus bill. There's always a victim out there that needs the government's protection. There's always an interest group that needs government funding or government resources, because the entire purpose of the system is we're going to loot the republic. We're going to it's a very cold, calculating interpretation of politics, which is I win, you lose. And I take power and to my friends, everything, to my enemies, the law. Yeah. Right. And it's no wonder.
Our side does have some.
No, our
like
side is
that
starting to get to that point where they realize.
Not even just starting. Even 10, 20 years ago, talk about farm subsidies and your own party's going to.
Oh, yeah, they'll kill you.
Turn on you. And so it's like there are some topics with Republicans where it's like they're all liberty all the time, all for, small government, less taxation, less government spending. Oh, but bring up farm subsidies or bring up, anything like Social Security or anything like that. And it's just, nope.
I'm not denying that Republicans don't also play this game of returning spoils basically to their favorite, coalition groups. But the scale here is just, there's no comparison between the scale of the Republicans doing this and the scale. The Democratic Party literally exists as a mechanism to transfer power and wealth to its interest groups. The Republican Party does not actually exist like that. The Republican Party as a whole largely exists as a mechanism to try to preserve, this gets into the whole nature of conservatism.
Yeah.
The Republican Party largely exists as a mechanism to try to preserve what they see as the foundational principles of the country. There's exceptions to that for sure.
Oh, there's a lot of exceptions.
There's a lot of
to
exceptions to that. But the Republican Party as an institution, people do not vote Republican because they expect that they're going to get rewarded in the form of political power and money in the form by their Republican politician.
I think that's largely true. I think your average Republican voter does not vote for a Republican because they think they're going to get a government handout as a result of it. Democrat voters absolutely vote for that reason. Not all of them, but a significant portion. Because in part, that's what Democrats promise.
And this is why you see a marriage between all of the interest groups that Democrats appeal to and the managerial class.
Well, you also see, like on the Republican side, it used to be, well, Republicans are like the cronyist with big business and stuff like that. And there was and is a massive problem with Republican politicians thinking that the way that you support American business is through, subsidies or favorable regulations as opposed to free market principles. And
public-private partnerships.
Oh my gosh. And I fight my colleagues on that all the time. What I will say, the reason why we're talking about this on Independence Day, right, is because we've talked multiple times about what are the necessary preconditions, what are the potential catalysts for conflict in the United States to break out, for a potential dissolution of the Union, which nobody at this table wants to see. And the reason why I think this is such an interesting topic is because the bureaucracy really is the federal bureaucracy really is the primary problem. I totally believe that. And we also talk about state bureaucracies as well. Anytime you have a massive government bureaucracy that is essentially able to operate with so little oversight, accountability, or impunity, you're going to run into problems. Why? Because the very nature of representative government is I am vesting power that belongs to me as a citizen into a representative who is then going to go out and fulfill the constitutionally authorized obligations of their office. And if they don't, I get to take that power back and give it to somebody else during the next election cycle. The problem that we currently have is that we're getting farther and farther away, not only from a constitutional republic, hell, at this point, it's not even democracy.
It's an oligarchy.
And the left doesn't want democracy, right? They don't. They love the bureaucracy. It's the experts. It's their friends. It's the people that went to the institutions of higher education, which they largely dominate, went through the appropriate classes, and then staff executive branch agencies in order to carry out their objectives and to slow roll the objectives of their political opponents. They love this system. And interestingly enough, every single leftist regime always moves toward this sort of oligarchy style system, regardless of what they call themselves, regardless of the various political processes that are supposed to be in place to serve as checks and balances and the will of the people. No. The will of the people always seems to find itself in the same little group of collectivist academics, intellectuals, and bureaucrats. Golly, why is that? You know what? When a system works a particular way over and over and over again, regardless of what it advertises, maybe it's time to start to wonder if the system is performing exactly the way it's intended, regardless of how it sells itself to the body politic.
Remember, the purpose of a system is what it does.
Yes. And so the reason why this is so critical right now, and the reason why the presidential debate, the reason why the Chevron decision, the reason why the presidential immunity, the reason why all of that is tied into this fight is because this election cycle, more than any other one in my lifetime, I'm 44, more than any other one in my lifetime, and I would argue more than any one probably since the beginning of the progressive era, maybe in all of history, all of American history, because it's such a unique thing, has been about a presidential candidate that recognizes how dangerous the bureaucracy was and desperately wants to do something about it. Right? There's been a lot of presidents that talked about the federal bureaucracy, and yet it grew during their administration. The federal government did not get smaller under Reagan.
Reagan campaigned on eliminating the Department of Education.
It got bigger.
It's still around today.
There's only been one president in the last 120 years that actually left the federal government smaller than when he found it, and it was Calvin Coolidge.
Our good old boy Silent Cal, my
It was
favorite
Calvin
president.
Coolidge. And here's what happened. Hoover got in. Hoover massively, the conservative. Hoover was not a conservative. He was a progressive as well. Hoover gets in there, drastically expands the role of the federal government. FDR gets in there and completely blows it out of the water. Completely blows it out of the water. There's no pretense anymore. And then Eisenhower doesn't pull it. Like Truman also grows it. Eisenhower doesn't pull it back. Kennedy continues to grow it. And it's just been a steady stream. You now have a president that recognized early on in his first administration, I've got a lot of people that supposedly work for me, not only standing in the way of what I'm trying to do, but actively working to take me down. Like for Trump, I think Trump saw this.
His business mind is probably just exploding.
His business mind is like, wait, I can't fire the people that are directly standing in the way of me doing my job. I'm forced to pay people. Now it's tax dollars, right? But I'm forced to manage it. I'm forced to manage agencies that are dedicated to my destruction? No, that can't be right. No, nobody can operate this way. How do I get rid of them? You can't. Now, they started to find very, very clever ways to push back. So, for instance, one of the ways a lot of these little bureaucracies, a lot of these little agencies, they set up new websites for their DEI program or for their outreach to this or that. And it's always left-wing oriented stuff. Well, the Trump administration set up a rule where you had to go to the OMB, you had to get approval for any new websites. All of a sudden, you see a decrease in all these little federal agencies coming up with their little pet project websites. So they were finding creative ways to push back. I think one of the reasons why they're so adamant about him not winning is because if he gets in this time, especially if he gets Congress, but even if he doesn't, I think he's going to do I don't think he's going to do things unconstitutionally, but I think he's going to do some things that are pretty drastic. And I think he's willing to take some risks because the bureaucracy has just spent the last 8 years trying to destroy him. Not just, I don't want you to be president. Not just, I don't want you to have your agenda. We want you broke and in prison.
Yeah.
And he's coming back going, all right, let's dance. And his side of the electorate is not all the cronyist businesses that like want a new little subsidy or want a little set aside. No. The energy behind his campaign is go stick it to him.
I think he needs a lot of very creative lawyers who have a lot of policy experience, who can come up with ways to make it a hostile environment to work for him.
I said it
so that people will leave on their own, and then he can shut down the position and not rehire it.
We were actually talking about this. I was talking about this with a group of people who had been in the Trump administration, who had been legislators, the whole deal. And we were talking about like, okay, legally, without Congress changing civil service laws, he can't fire him. But what can he do? And I was like, well, he can pay him to stay at home. Don't do your job. I'm going to pay you to sit at home, but don't show up to work. And someone looked at me and was like, you're just going to piss off taxpayers. I'm like, good. They should be pissed that their lives are better. Because this is what I want them to see. Your life is better when these federal bureaucrats, and we're not talking about every single federal position, but your life is better when these federal bureaucrats don't show up to work. You are paying them through your tax dollars ostensibly to make the country a better place. And lo and behold, paying them to sit at home on their butt and eat Oreos is a better use of your tax dollars than letting them show up to work and do what they want to do.
I have a question.
And he said, he's like, well, yeah, but they'll get mad. Like, yes. And then they'll demand that these positions go away.
Yeah.
It's one of the unintended consequences every once in a while when the government will shut down.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, non-essential personnel are not working. And then people start going, wait a second. So this had no effect on my life whatsoever? Why are we paying billions upon hundreds of billions of dollars every year to fund bureaucracies that I can't tell when they're gone? Why are we doing that? Right? So I had that idea. Somebody else had a better idea. They're like, you know what I would do? They're like, I would go in there and you would have to be, again, you got to get some good lawyers. And it's like, no, I'm not going to let them sit at home. I'm going to go have them clean graffiti in the inner cities. I'm going to walk them right into the bluest districts. And I'm going to say, you know what?
Change the job descriptions.
You know what? We don't need you to do all this other stuff that you were currently doing. You know what we really need you to do to protect the environment?
We need you to pick up trash on the side of the highway.
Yeah, EPA, that's what we need you to do. We're going to put you on the front lines of cleaning the environment. We're not going to have you promulgate all these regulations or come up with more rules. No. You're going to go into downtown Philadelphia and you're going to do area beautification. That's right. You're going to pick up trash on the interstate. That's your job, Environmental Protection Agency. Hey, Department of Energy, the people that were supposed to, make us not dependent on foreign oil, but has actually made our own production more expensive. We got some interesting plans for you as well. In fact, we're going to go through every single federal department, agency, bureau that we don't think needs to exist, and we got some new job descriptions for you. So no, you're going to work. You're going to work for the money that you get, but you're going to do something that might actually be beneficial to some of these communities. Yeah. And we'll see how long you stay. We don't got to kick you out. Oh, you'll leave by the time we're done.
It seems to me like another possibility, and I could totally be wrong, but why couldn't they, whenever somebody retires, shut down the position? Whenever someone quits, shut down the position and reduce it that way to the point, and don't do any new hires, and literally just shrink it down to where now this went from 100 positions down to 15 positions. You could
do that to some degree, unless Congress has specifically dictated like this many people in a particular organ. Because that's the other thing, right? Congress can get more specific on what they require of an agency. They can create an agency and says it has to do this. You got to have this many people, but they typically don't.
Yeah. So
because they're like, well, we're going to let the experts run this. That's why you would go in there and you empower your director heads to be able to say any new positions we cut, and you dare Congress to come in and no, we insist that you have to have this many federal bureaucrats. Part of this whole strategy needs to be, look, I'm the chief executive. The people put their trust in me to do this, not you. So I'm going to we're going to do this now. I didn't cut the budget. I didn't cut this. No. I simply said, this is the way you're going to take care of the environment now, right? These are the things that you're going to do to make the country better. And if you don't like that, you're welcome to leave. We just won't replace you.
Yeah.
No, that's the sort of thing that I think
just shut down the position. Don't hire for the new positions, and shut down any position where people leave. Let the attrition be real attrition.
Yeah. And even if you could, there's other things that you can do, right? Because if you're responsible, like let's say you can't fire them. And let's say that Congress even said, well, you got to have so many positions. You don't got to make it easy to hire somebody. You can promulgate new regulations on the sort of requirements that you have to have in order to operate that job. Oh, wait, you mean nobody has the requisite requirements? You got to have, whatever, I don't know, experience doing things that nobody has experience doing.
Take the agency out of these big lavish buildings and put them in some really tight, rat-infested places.
You know what we're going to do?
Relocate them all to the Alaskan gulags. That's, remember that episode?
The EPA is now housed in Fairbanks, Alaska.
Yeah.
Good luck with your recruiting efforts.
I remember we did an episode where we talked about, certain things, and I was like, well, I'll tell you what I would do. I would shut down the buildings and stop cutting the checks and tell the Secretary of the Treasury these people are fired. And if they sue, be like, that's great. You and whose army is gonna overturn my decision. They take it to the Supreme Court. That's great. Chief Justice Roberts has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Like I would force the showdown that needs to happen, that will eventually happen one way or the other, because the enemy,
I think you run into the Rudyard problem there.
If you're the president doing it, it's a little bit different than if you're the Boogaloo Boys that are going to say, we're going to march on D.C. and put an end to this in a weekend.
Could you require that any new purchases for these offices, whether it's equipment, in the facilities or whatever, chairs, desks, cubicles, whatever it might be just always awarded to the lowest bidder no matter what? Well, that you get the crappiest product
we already
you could possibly
do that,
get.
Trust me.
Yeah, we do that.
We already do that. So they have within federal contracting, they have a whole host of rules, and some of them are what they call LPTA, lowest price, technically acceptable. And I'll tell you a quick funny story about that. I was actually advising on an LPTA government contract. So lowest price, technically acceptable, which means they give you certain technical requirements, and as long as you meet them, whoever has the lowest price wins. And this one federal agency was like, this is the technical requirements, but we'd prefer this. And I said, cool. Don't care what you prefer because you said lowest price, technically acceptable. So you're not allowed to tell me, you're not allowed to decide this contract based off of what you prefer, as long as you meet the technical requirements and you come in at the lowest price. And so, yeah, you could do that. Like, you could mandate certain contracts only be LPTA. You could also set up other rules.
No chairs, standing desks only, things like that.
We're fighting obesity.
It'd be so much easier to just go full DC Delonda Est and
I don't think so.
Make a desert and call it peace.
The reason why I think that's problematic is because, again, if you operate in such a manner as to give your opponent some sort of moral victory or legal victory, that can be problematic. And I think you can do enough stuff totally within the law to where when they challenge it, it's like, what are you going to do? And then here's the other thing that ends up happening, right? Because the Democratic Party, let's face it, I don't see Trump getting the House and the Senate at the same time. But maybe if he does, he's got to operate as fast as he can within 2 years, because of midterms, who knows what'll happen.
Yeah, but people like Susan Collins will wet the bed again.
Yeah, they will every time. But here's the issue, right? Here's the thing that you got to ask yourself is, I don't care what the Democrats say their agenda is. If the federal bureaucracy starts screaming, they will make the federal bureaucracy their agenda. Nobody wants to run on that. Right? That is not a safe place to run.
Oh, you know that they'll say there'll be blood on his hands because closing down this agency means that people will die.
But the thing is that you're right. You're absolutely right. They're going to say people will die, and then Trump's going to be like, yeah, we'll see. And then when people don't die, it's
like, remember when everybody said Twitter was going to shut down when Elon fired 75% of Twitter?
Yeah.
In fact, there was a day on Twitter where everybody was like, oh, the site's going to go down tonight. I guess I'll see you later. Or we're going to go over to this place. Like, everybody on the left was like, I guess this is it for Twitter. See you guys around. And then it was like the next day came and nothing happened. And there was like all this hype and buildup because there were disgruntled ex-employees of Twitter that were on the left that had just been fired and was basically like, oh man, this thing can't function without us. And then Elon proved, no, you can fire 75% of Twitter and it'll be totally fine.
Yeah.
Malay is doing the same thing in Argentina. You can fire 50,000 bureaucrats in a weekend and in fact, actually things will get better, not worse.
The difference is that when you do that at Twitter, what happens is Elon Musk and any shareholders make more money, which is great, right? Which is great. And because of the people he fired, there's less censorship because you're hiring a lot of people to censor. When Trump does this, he's going to be able to take savings, either give it back to people in the form of tax cuts, or he'll be able to reallocate it into something that people actually want, right? He'll be able to actually recover stuff or bring down the debt or, whatever, but he'll be actually able to do something that are tangible to the people. And here will be the biggest difference. And this part is important. The Democrats love to take money from people who have earned it and give it to people who vote for them. Donald Trump will be taking money away from people who are living off of taxpayers and give it back to the people that earned it. That is a very different proposition. Not to mention the fact that at the same time he's doing it, every single individual, property owner, business that is trying to operate and is constantly being held up by an expansive federal bureaucracy who are no longer held up. And so they're able to build more, invest more, hire more, give bonuses. All of that has a ripple effect. And the fact is that if he makes it all about the federal bureaucracy and the Democrats choose the federal bureaucracy as the hill to die on, and I don't think they're going to have much of a choice, and all of a sudden people's lives are not only the same without the federal bureaucracy, but better as a result, oh, baby. We actually have a mechanism. If Trump really does it, we actually have a mechanism for making one of the best arguments any president could have made for smaller, limited government, freer markets, and isolating the federal bureaucracy as the main source of the problem. We have an opportunity to do that in a way that has not been done in over a century. And they know it. They absolutely know it, that they are now messing with a guy who knows what the problem is and is gunning for him and is willing to go after him in ways that no other Republican president has been willing to. And will do so with Republicans in Congress and the Senate that, quite frankly, many of which will be terrified to not follow his lead on it. And he will actually get allies out of Congress that had previously had to stand up to him, guys like Thomas Massey. right? Guys like Rand Paul, guys who wanted to see the federal bureaucracy taken down, and now they're going to fully be on board with helping him do it. So quite frankly, I'm all here for Peaceful American Revolution Part 2, where once again, we take the aspects of our government that are not at all representative, right? The aspects of our government that are making our lives worse, and we give them pink slips, baby. Like, I'm all here for it. That is the sort of American, not revolution, but as Christian pointed out, restoration that we need, that we absolutely have to have. And if we get it, we can start to see significant fundamental changes to just about everything else, because there is nothing the federal bureaucracy does not touch and in many cases pervert or make worse. And now we got a guy that wants to go at it, not simply for ideological reasons, it's personal. And let's face it, you might be able to convince Trump to do something different on ideological grounds, but you go after him personally, he's coming back personally. And we can argue all day long on whether or not philosophically that's the most ideal approach that we would like. I think we're at a point where we need someone that this is personal for him. And so I'm here for it. I am absolutely here for it. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. First of all, we want to make sure that everyone has a wonderful Independence Day. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Once again, go over to jeremysrazors.com, use promo code Nick in order to get 15% off of your order. And the other thing that I just want to close with. Everyone here on this podcast, everyone on our team, we love our country. You would be hard pressed to find people more patriotic, more in love with the idea of what this country is supposed to be. And we have an opportunity this year. I think this election cycle, you know us. We don't sit here and say vote harder is the cure to everything. But I do think we might have a chance right here to make an outsized impact in the political world, one that has certainly not been available within my lifetime. In part because we're properly identifying the problem. And it's not all just politicians. It's this unelected bureaucracy that has taken control of so much of not just our government, but our lives, our futures, our businesses, our property. And this really is a unique opportunity to go after it. It's not the only thing that you got to do. We've constantly got to be focusing on the things that we do control, whether it's raising our families, whether it's running our businesses, taking care of our property, our community, our family. That's all important. And it is where the vast majority of our attention should be directed. But I am telling you, I think there's something different this time around. And I have never been one of those people to say most important election of our lifetime. I think this one is. And so let's not only get out there and try to do everything that we can to save our country in the most peaceful way possible, which I think this is it. But let's make sure that when people are elected, they know why they got elected. And they got elected to take this federal bureaucracy to task and once again restore proper representative government to the United States, so that the people that we voluntarily give power to on our behalf can be held accountable when they don't do their job instead of unelected officials doing it. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful Independence Day. God bless, and we'll see you next time.